Hello students, welcome to the English optional course for BA First Sem. I am Dr. Vidya Patil, serving as Assistant Professor of English at Government First Grade Women's College, Bidar. In today's video, we will be discussing about a few topics from the second unit, that is reading poetry. Today I will be taking up the topic, what is poetry? And under this topic, we will be discussing two important aspects. The first aspect which we will try to understand is the difference between prose and poetry. And the second aspect which we will try to understand is the relation between poetry and morality. So students, let us now begin with this session. So students, let us now begin with the topic, what is poetry? Poems are quite different from the ordinary speech or writing which we all indulge in. Poetry is something which is created because of the innovative use of language, which we find not used commonly when we are speaking or writing. The word poetry is derived from the Greek word poesis, which means to make. Poetry communicates using certain special elements of language which make it different from ordinary speech or writing. It is a form of literature which makes use of aesthetic and rhythmic qualities in order to add additional meanings to the ordinary words which have been used. That is, poetry uses certain such elements which increases and adds value and meaning to the words which have been used. Now let us have a look at the definition of poetry. You will find as many definitions of poetry as we have poets, because each poet has his own way of understanding and defining poetry. One of the most popular and commonly used definitions of poetry is that which has been given by Wordsworth. He says, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. What this means is that poetry is generally originated from a heightened state of feelings or emotions. The next definition which we'll try to understand is that which has been given by Edgar Allan Poe. He says, poetry is the rhythmical creation of beauty in words. So, here he is talking about the rhythmical aspect of poetry. Another very famous definition of poetry is that which has been given by Robert Frost. He says, poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. So, what he actually means here is that poetry happens when you experience a particular feeling or emotion which sparks off a thought in your mind. This thought then finds expression in words. So, students, you can see that poetry basically is dealing with feelings or emotions, which also has a rhythmic aspect and creative use of language. One of the most common characteristics of poetry is that it cannot be defined or labeled. Poetry has a nature of its own and it does not subscribe to any definitions or cannot be curtailed within the boundaries of a definition. Poetry is the chiseled use of language. One of the most definable characteristics of poetry is its economy of language. Using the minimum number of words, we are able to express many ideas. The poet innovatively uses the right choice of words and the right forms to express himself. Thus, the poet, using creative language, manages to transform his feelings into an extraordinary thought. Poetry is evocative. That is, when you read poetry, it manages to awaken or arouse intense emotions such as joy, sorrow, anger, hatred, love, etc. A good poet is one who is able to magnify his own feelings or emotions in his poems. Poetry has the ability to surprise the reader. When you read the poem and come to the end of it, usually you get an aha experience. That is, it gives you a revelation or it gives you a deeper insight or further understanding about the universal truths. It adds to the understanding of the elemental natures. That is, you get a much more better understanding about the realities of life. In the famous words of John Keats, which I would like to repeat here, he said, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know." In these lines, John Keats talks about the power of art to translate or to help us understand the human experiences. So, it is only through art that we can understand human experiences. We can get a better understanding of the universal truths of this world. And poetry is one such magnificent art form. Poetry is an ever evolving genre. That is, poetry has an art form which has continuously adapted and evolved itself according to the social conditions prevalent at that particular period. This ability to continuously evolve has kept poetry as an art form alive since the ancient ages. Poetry is a type of literature which is based on the creative use of words and rhythm. In poetry, words are arranged in such a manner so that they can form sounds, create images, and express ideas which might be very complex and abstract to describe in a normal way. Poetry plays an important role in our lives because it helps us understand and appreciate the world around us. To sum it up, we can say that poetry teaches us how to live. The next topic which we will be dealing with in this video is poetry and morality. Poetry plays a major role in facilitating the spiritual and moral development of an individual. The role of poetry is very significant in the educational process of a human being. Poems are moral statements. This is not because poems pass stringent or strict judgments about people, but it is because poems deal with human values. In order to understand the relation between poetry and morality, it is necessary that we understand the terms morals, moralist, and poems. Morals refers to certain codes or prohibitions, certain rules which we need to follow to call ourselves civilized. There is a rigorous distinction between what is right and what is wrong. Morals are a kind of judgmental aspect or an evaluative aspect of human behavior. Moralist is the one who is interested in human values and human welfare. Poems, as I have just explained in the previous slide, are moral statements, but not because they pass judgments, but because they deal with human values, meanings, and purposes. Now, students, in order to explain this, I would like to give you an example. On the screen in front of you, there is a sentence which reads, "She stood before the great carved door of the cathedral, her head bowed." This means that there is a great carved door of a cathedral and a woman is standing in front of it. This is a factual statement where a simple fact is being stated that a woman is standing in front of the door of a cathedral. The second sentence reads, "She stood before the great carved door of the cathedral, her head bowed in grief." Now, the second sentence means that the woman who was standing in front of the great carved door of the cathedral had bowed her head because of grief or sorrow. As soon as we see this human aspect added into the earlier words, we find that the entire meaning of the sentence changes and our reaction as a reader also changes. This is the basic difference between a factual statement and a moral statement. The factual statement is merely a description where a scene is being described to you and does not really evoke any feelings in you. Whereas the second sentence is a moral statement because it not just evokes the feeling of grief and sorrow which you feel or which you experience when you read these lines, but it also makes you think about what may be the cause of that grief and sorrow. So it is this human element, the human feelings, which when added to the words transforms these ordinary words into a moral statement. So students, what we now need to understand is that all types of literature include factual statements. But these statements are not present just for the sake of giving any information. The factual statements are most often used for non-factual effects, especially in poetry. For example, when we use the term keep left, the factual connotation or the literal meaning of these words is that we need to keep to the left side of the road. But the actual political connotation which we get from this is that we need to subscribe to the left-wing ideology. Now students, you must be knowing that right-wing generally means the capitalist ideology, whereas the left wing refers to the communist ideology. So, though the words keep left have been used and may mean a very ordinary thing, the actual meaning which is being conveyed is something else. Therefore, factual statements in a poem are not there simply to give us some information, but they play an important role in introducing the moral aspect to the poem. Students, you can now see a famous quotation of P.B. Shelley on your screens. Here, I would like to quote him. "Poetry strengthens that faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. So, what he's saying here is that just as exercise is necessary to strengthen your body, similarly, poetry is necessary to strengthen the moral fiber of an individual. So, students, it is not necessary that literature should always have a moral element to it, but literature should always hold a mirror up to mankind and show us our true selves. Literature and poetry explores the world and the human condition. They reflect upon human nature in a very clear manner. The true purpose of poetry is to instill in us what it means to be human. That is, poetry helps us to understand the world around us. Poetry helps us to understand the human nature. In short, poetry helps us to understand life. So, students, I am sure you have understood about what is poetry, the difference between prose and poetry, and the relationship between poetry and morality. I hope you liked this video. Thank you.